Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks' salary cap situation going into the 2019 off-season. So currently the Sharks do have a few players obviously under contract, outlining here Couture, Hurdle, Kane, Sorensen, Redill, Goodrow, and Carlson as the main forwards who are under contract who have actually played a decent amount of games with the Sharks this past season. And as well on defense, Šimek, Burns, Vlasic, Braun, and Dillon, with both Jones and Dell in goal. What the Sharks are missing is about 5 forwards, which are likely to be 3 top 6 forwards and then a couple of third liners, as well as a bottom pairing defenseman. All of these players combined give the Sharks just about $24.7 million in terms of cap space. This is estimating, this is assuming, I should say, that the cap actually rises to a maximum of $83 million. So the Sharks do have a bunch of pending RFAs and UFAs, and the first would be Kevin Labanc, who managed to get 17 goals, 39 assists, and 56 points during this past regular season. A very successful regular season for Kevin Labanc. He played the entirety of it, ended up also with about 9 points during the 20 playoff games he played, and so as a projection, I suspect Labanc will end up getting a bridge deal. I don't think Labanc has shown enough to actually warrant getting a long-term deal, and considering the situation the Sharks are in, it's likely that they'll favor a bridge deal anyhow. And so Labanc will likely get 2 or maybe 3 years at just about $3.5 to potentially even $4 million. You can't underestimate the fact that he is quite strong on the power play, and 56 points is very good, is usually good enough to be a strong second liner. And so I suspect on that bridge deal, it'll be just about $3.5 to $4 million. Next is Timo Meier, another RFA, 78 games played with 30 goals, 36 assists, and 66 points. In the playoffs, he also was quite strong with about 15 points, if I'm not mistaken, in the 20 games that he did play. And in my December video, in which I had also discussed the salary cap, I said that it's unlikely Meier would want to go for a bridge deal because it looked like he was on the way to a fantastic season. He still had a very strong season, but 30 goals here for Timo Meier is basically what should be expected for the majority of his career. He didn't hit like 40 or even close to 50 goals like he was projected to at some point, or at least he was on pace to at some point. And as such, I think it's in the Sharks' best interest, and Meier will probably not be too much against it to go for a bridge deal. I believe even Doug Wilson has sort of feigned to that, result with Timo Meier. And so I assume it'll also be about 2 or 3 years with a value of about $5 to potentially $5.5 million. That should save them a good $1.5 million to maybe even $2 million on what they'd have to give him if they wanted to get, like, say, a $7 or $8 million contract long term. Next, a UFA, Jonas Donskoi, 80 games played, 14 goals, 23 assists for 37 points. Donskoi is an interesting one because obviously 37 points doesn't seem all too bad, but for someone who's watched Jonas Donskoi, even if he is a fan favorite, even if he's going to have his name in the Sharks record books for the rest of his, for the rest of time, I guess, because he is the game-winning goal in overtime for the Sharks' first ever Stanley Cup Finals victory. Even including all that, we know that Donskoi is a player who is, often a passenger in games, is just not effective enough in enough games. He had a time where he had almost a 40-game streak of games where he had 0 goals in all of them. The Sharks came into the playoffs this year completely healthy, or at least players all playing, not necessarily completely healthy, of course, Erik Karlsson, and Donskoi was the 13th forward. Even Michael Haley was chosen to play above Jonas Donskoi, which of course can be, explained by the fact that Peter DeBoer likes Michael Haley, but just the fact that Donskoi is even in a position to be played above, to be played below Michael Haley, have Haley play above him, is, telling of what exactly Donskoi did for this team. So I suspect Donskoi is unlikely to be back here with the San Jose Sharks. He'll probably try and get a different opportunity, a different start with a different team. I don't think he'll end up with 1 year. I think teams will be a bit more willing to take a chance with him. I think 2 years is probably what Donskoi is going to get, and just about $2 million. It's extremely unlikely he can go below that because he did still get 37 points, but I don't think he'll go much higher. Next is Joe Pavelski, 75 games played, 38 goals, 26 assists for 64 points. Joe Pavelski, a successful season, a great rebound season from his previous one where he had a similar amount of points, but not even close to a similar amount of goals. 38 goals is obviously huge for a player, but he is at about 35 years of age, so he's at that point where you're signing maybe 2 to 3 year types of contracts, and this has the potential to be Pavelski's final big contract in the National Hockey League, so he probably wants to get the most out of it. I suspect 2 years will be way too low for Pavelski. I think he'll want a bit more job security than that. I suspect 4 years will be way too much for most teams to take a chance on him, and as such, 3 years will probably be that perfect sweet spot. Now, I do have a bit of a bigger range for Joe Pavelski just because I think 6.5 is probably the low end of it, just if he wants to stay with the Sharks. The Sharks are going to be, trying to crunch the numbers to get everything to fit just barely under the salary cap ceiling, and as such, I think Pavelski might take a bit of a hometown discount. If not, if the Sharks don't want to sign Pavelski and he goes to the open market, I assume he'll try and get as much money as possible, and as such, he could probably get just about $7.5 million from some of the other teams around the league if they are desperate enough. But as the captain of the Sharks, as a player who has been with the Sharks for over 15 years, has played with the Sharks on the team for over a dozen years, he's a player who I could see taking a bit less than he might deserve to continue staying with this organization. Next is Gustav Nyquist, 81 games played, 22 goals, 38 assists for 60 points. This was not all with the Sharks, but it was actually rather impressive, his stint with the Sharks, at least on paper. 11 points through the 19 games he played with them after the trade deadline, which for a trade deadline acquisition that normally takes some time to, get used to the situation, that's actually pretty good, as well as 11 points through the 20 playoff games that he did play. So he did show some promise on this new team with the Sharks. It's possible that the Sharks decide to retain him, but I think it's maybe a bit more unlikely. My projection for what he'll get, he's age 29, he'll be age 30 by the start of the next season. As such, I suspect about 5 years, potentially 6 years if a team is desperate enough. And I suspect he'll get just about $5.5 million, maybe even $6 million. As I said, 60 points is quite good, and the market continues to climb in terms of numbers, in terms of how much a player will be given for a contract. And because of the fact that he did show some promise on a new team, and he'll be going to likely a new team, unless of course I guess he re-signs with like Detroit, I suspect he'll be able to get at a max just about $6 million, but likely more in the 5.5 range. Next is Antti Suomela, a player here it's a bit of a weird inclusion. I didn't include every single, free agent that the Sharks have to sign, so someone like Dylan Gambrell, I'm mostly just assuming he will be back. But since Suomela did play a few games with the Sharks, 27, with 3 goals, 5 assists, and 8 points, I decided to include him. He is an RFA, however, and so I project that he will re-sign with the Sharks, likely just a single year, however. And he'll probably get within like the 800 to 900,000 range. He was decent with the Sharks in the NHL, got sent to the AHL and wasn't that great with the Barracuda. So I don't think he really deserves even much more than even just $1 million. Next is Joakim Ryan on to the defense. 44 games played with just 7 assists, 0 goals. I project that Ryan will likely re-sign because he is also a restricted free agent, but will likely also only get a single year. I project he'll probably get just about $1 million because technically Ryan is somewhat of a serviceable 6th defenseman. He still has some hope with him, even if he wasn't that great this season. However, it's likely he projects to be, probably about a 7th defenseman come next season, which isn't that bad for him. But still, it's not great with how the Sharks maybe saw him panning out just a year ago. Next is Tim Heed, who played 37 games, 2 goals, 11 assists for 13 points. I suspect Heed will stay on the Sharks and actually play a decent role for them in the top 6. Heed at times during the season was actually rather impressive. At other times, he wasn't that great. But with, Karlsson being a huge question mark and Tim Heed still being a decent offensive option, I will predict that he will stay with the team, but probably just on a single-year basis. He is a UFA, so he has options to go elsewhere. But I say 1 year just to sort of give the Sharks maybe one last chance now that there is an opening for him to actually play consistently on this team. Give him one last chance to actually get decent ice time. And if it doesn't work out there, I suspect Heed would leave in the next offseason. But I think he will stay for this one and he'll get just about $1 million as well. Unless, of course, another team manages to drag him away with a big, dollar amount of like close to $2 million. At that point, I don't think Tim Heed can really say no. Finally, we have to talk about Erik Karlsson. 53 games played, 3 goals, 42 assists for 45 points. possible projection is obviously 7 to 8 years. 8 years if he manages to stay with the Sharks, 7 years with basically every other team. There is no chance he signs for any less than that, especially considering the fact that injuries are a potential scare for Karlsson. There's no way he would sign for something like 5 years to try and get maybe more money out of a team with more cap space, because there would be way too little job security for someone like Erik Karlsson. And for a dollar amount, I project from about 9.5 to likely a high of about $11 million. It's impossible, I would say, that it goes much less than 9.5. It's possible it goes higher than 11 if there is some sort of bidding war that occurs. But the 9.5 is also for the Sharks, not that Karlsson would take a hometown discount, but because of the fact that the Sharks can give that extra year. So for instance, 8 years at $10 million is $80 million as a contract, which Karlsson, as I said, will appreciate because of the extra year of job security. Compared to a team who might give him $11 million, but only for 7 years, that's only $77 million and one less year of job security. That's a $3 million left in terms of the contract. So the Sharks have the advantage of being able to sign him for less cap hit because they can give him the extra year. So that could be good for the Sharks. But it does seem as though it seems more likely Karlsson leaves than he stays. Nobody knows anything for sure, but there have been rumors of him maybe going back to Ottawa even, potentially Montreal, potentially even Tampa if they could somehow, do some black magic of some sort that make him fit under the salary cap. So it's possible, and we have seen Karlsson when he's not injured and when he's not, in the first month with the team, we have seen him play at an extremely high level that would probably make it somewhat attractive to try and bring him back. From the start of December to about mid-January, he was rolling completely. He might have been even the best player on the Sharks for that time period, and the Sharks were playing extremely well. If the Sharks can actually get a full season or close to a full season of that Erik Karlsson, they would be an extremely dangerous team to play against. Onto potential lineups for the next season. The first one I have is called the safe lineup. So this is basically a lineup that tries to change as little as possible. It does not include Erik Karlsson, that would be way too much money, but it basically includes almost every other player who was on the team. So that would be Meier, Couture, Pavelski, Kane, Hurdle, Nyquist, Sorensen, Thornton, LeBanc, and then Goodrow, Gambrell, and Karlsson, with the pairings of Shemek, Burns, Vlasic, Braun, Dillon, Heed, and then Jones and Dell. This is assuming that Meier signs for around $5 million, Pavelski at around $7 million, Nyquist at about $5.5 million, LeBanc at about $3.5 million, and then Heed at about $1 million. Thornton is the question mark. I don't know if Thornton is going to retire or not. That's why I didn't really have him in the predicted contracts. Also, it's kind of hard to predict what contract he would get because it's likely he's going to get basically whatever is on the salary cap, whatever is left to hit the $83 million cap ceiling. So if there's $3 million left, he'll get $3 million. Maybe if there's just $1.5 million, he'll get $1.5 million. Otherwise, it would probably be someone like Suomela or maybe some very cheap free agent. But that would leave the Sharks with just about $1 million in terms of cap space, depending on how much Thornton takes if he does play. And as I said, this is a pretty safe bet. This is a team that on paper is likely a step back from what it was this past season, but it is still rather safe bet to make the playoffs, and I guess you never know what happens when your team makes the playoffs. Once you're there, anything can happen. The next is what I call the Karlsson lineup. So this is basically you do as much as, you try to not change the team too much, but you still try and get Erik Karlsson in. So obviously there are a couple of casualties. The main one, of course, being that there is no Justin Braun here. This includes a trade for Justin Braun. So this would be Meier, Couture, Pavelski, Kane, Hurdle, LeBanc, Sorensen, potentially Thornton, and then some sort of prospect from the Sharks prospect pool, and then Goodrow, Gambrell, Karlsson, and then Shemek, Burns, Vlasic, Karlsson, Erik Karlsson, Dillon, Heed, and then Jones and Dell. So obviously there are other options to trade. You could trade Brendan Dillon, you could trade Melker Karlsson, but I feel as though Justin Braun carries the most value and would probably be the most likely to be traded. He's a defender who is still very good. I know a lot of people may have been tainted with their perception of Justin Braun because of this past year, but prior to this one with Erik Karlsson, Justin Braun was still playing on, the top defensive pairing for the Sharks. When the Sharks needed to kill off some minutes, when they needed to play against the other team's top lines, they would send out Vlasic, Braun, and while Vlasic, of course, maybe did most of the heavy lifting on that pairing, Braun was certainly no slouch, very strong defenseman still, and so him going to a team, let's say, like the Buffalo Sabres, he could potentially play with someone like Ristolainen on the first pairing, maybe with Dahlin on the second pairing. He would definitely be top 4 on basically the vast majority of NHL teams besides maybe like Nashville, and he's extremely cost controlled for the year at just $3.8 million for the next season, and so he could command potentially even a late first round pick, maybe more of a middling prospect and something like a second or third round pick. So Braun shouldn't be too difficult to unload if necessary. And then the rest, this would be Meyer taking about $5 million, Pavelski about 7, which would be 12 together. Then Carlson taking about 10, that would be 22. Then LeBanc at about 3.5, which would be 25.5. Heed with about 26.5, and in like having $24.7 million that they would have normally, with the unloading of Justin Braun, they would have about 28.5, which would leave them with about $2 million in terms of cap space after all that. At that point, you put in a prospect on an ELC. That leaves you with about $1.2 million, and then either you give the rest to Thornton if he wants to come back for that little, or you go with something like a Suomela or some other center prospect that you could potentially play. So that would be what you would probably do to try and fit Erik Karlsson in the lineup. Is this lineup better than what the Sharks were fielding this past season? I'm not sure. It might be somewhat less good than it was. However, without Nyquist at the start of that season, as we saw from December to January, it was still quite strong, and this is basically what that would be. So it's still certainly a lineup that can be a favorite. Finally, I have what I would call the radical lineup. So this actually makes a decent amount of changes to this team. So as you can see, the first name just on it, Artemi Panarin, would be a huge name for the Sharks to be able to acquire, but would require them to move some pieces around. So the team would be Panarin, Couture, Meyer, Kane, Hertl, LeBanc, Sorensen, Thornton, and then some sort of free agent or prospect of some sort, and then Goodrow, Gambrell, and Carlson, and then Shemek, Burns, Vlasic, Braun, Dillon, and Heed with Jones and Dell. So this would be assuming with Artemi Panarin last season, he got 79 games played, 28 goals with 59 assists for 87 points. So it's likely he signs for 7 years. That's basically the max that he's going to get, unless of course he ends up staying with Columbus, which is extremely unlikely at this point. He could get an 8th year, and it's likely he gets between about $10 to $11 million, becoming the highest paid winger in the league. Just because you're taking a look at someone like Jeff Skinner, who is almost about to sign for about $9 million with the Buffalo Sabres. Panarin is a much better winger than Jeff Skinner. So if there's some sort of bidding war, I could see getting up to $11 million. For this sake, I'll assume maybe 10.5 for 7 years. So at Panarin, 10.5, Meyer at about 5, that's 15.5. LeBanc at about 3.5, that would be 19. With Heed, another million, that's about 20. So that leaves you with about 4.7 in terms of cap space. Now there's two options that you can do at that point. You could either trade Justin Braun in this scenario as well, keep Pavelski, and then give the rest to Joe Thornton. That is possible. Or with the 4.7 you have, either give a bunch to Thornton and have a prospect play on your third line winger, or you sign a decent free agent at, let's say, $3.5 to $4 million to play on your third line and go with someone like Suomela. So as I said, this is a bit of a radical change that you could do to the lineup. If you want to inject someone like a superstar forward, like a Panarin, this situation could work somewhat similarly with someone like Duchesne as well. But those would be your two main options. Otherwise, you either go for Carlson or you do what I have in the first section, which is play it a bit more safe, guarantee or close to guarantee your spot in the playoff, but maybe not be that much of a playoff favorite. But that will do it. The Sharks are in for a crazy offseason. There's many other combinations that include keeping Nyquist and not keeping Pavelski. Maybe keep Donskoy. That's also a possibility for my radical change. Maybe you don't sign a superstar forward, but you sign some of the other lower ones like a Kevin Hayes or something, or a Ryan DeZingle. So many options here. I only outlined 3 that could take the team in a completely different path. But one thing is for sure is that Doug Wilson certainly has his work cut out for him this offseason. Class dismissed.